And this Sikha is going to speak about the famous question about the problem of Yosef, that why was Yosef punished, that he had to be imprisoned another 2 years because he asked the Sarah Mashkim, the butler, to mention him to Pari. The Rebbe is going to address this question a little bit differently than what's usually spoken about in this question. Usually what says is that Yosef HaTzadik was such a high level that he was completely out of this world. His level was a level of that he could even be in Mitzrayim and not be affected by it, so the world didn't play any type of significance by him. So therefore, he did not have to do anything of worldly things. As opposed to, let's say, Yaakov. Yaakov did 3 things. He prepared for war with Esav, he sent him a gift, he davened, etc. Here the Rebbe is going to take a different approach. And the Rebbe is going to explain it in a way of Pshuta Shel Mikra. He's going to examine 2 different Rashis that seem to contradict each other about the purpose of the whole idea of Yosef being imprisoned with the butler and the baker, etc. And therefore, in a way, from this Sikha, it's a lot more practical for us. We're not on the level of Yosef HaTzadik that we don't have to do physical things. Here we're going to explain, yes, there is the idea of Yosef HaTzadik that applies to us as well in how we are supposed to be involved in the physical, which is the whole idea of the Rebbe always talking about Bitochon and so on. We're going to start from where it says Ois Chav Ches, that it says it's like 4 or 5 paragraphs in the bottom of the page, and the Rebbe was talking about earlier a different Rashi on Parshas Vayeshev, and then he goes on to say, "K'moiken yeshne inyan adoyrish biur b'siyum Parshaseinu." So too, there's a matter that needs explanation at the conclusion of our parsha, meaning the conclusion of Parshas Vayeshev. On the pasuk that says that the butler did not remember Yosef and he forgot him. Rashi explains, Mishnah told about Yosef l'zachroi, since Yosef depended upon the Sarah Mashkin, the butler, to remember him and to make sure to tell Pari and so on. Huskak liyis asur shtei shonim, he had to be imprisoned 2 years. Shenamar, like it says, Ashri agever shesam Hashem miftachoi, fortunate is a man that places his trust and confidence in Hashem, and he does not turn to the arrogant ones. What does it mean, Rahavim? He does not place his trust on Mitzrayim, that's called Rahav. That's the Rahavim over there. They're called arrogant, or whatever other reason they're called Rahav. So Yosef violated that pasuk that says Ashri Agev Rosh Hashanah Hashem Miftachim. That's what Rashi explains why Yosef sat 2 years extra in prison. So the Rebbe asks, we need to understand at the beginning of this whole story of Yosef and the butler and the baker, skip the parentheses, Nemar it says, and it was after these matters, Chatu Mashke Melch Mitzrayim v'goyim. The butler of the king of Mitzrayim and the baker, they committed an offense, and because of that they were imprisoned, etc. Mefarish Rashi, and Rashi explains, why does it say Achar Advarim Eila, after these things? In other words, the Torah is making a connection with what it said earlier, with the whole story with Eishes Potiphar and so on. Why is it? What's the connection? The fish here, since that cursed woman, the wife of Potiphar, got everybody accustomed to speak about Yosef HaTzadik. It was a big scandal, it was a big news. Hashem brought upon the whole scandal about these two, about the butler and the baker, so that they should now turn their attention to the story with the butler and the baker and the new scandal that took place in Pari's household, and they will turn away from the news. It's a short news cycle, and they'll turn away from what happened with Yosef and the wife of Potiphar. That's one reason. And another reason why it says Achar Dvarim Ha'ela, Shetavei Harvacha L'Tzadik Al Yideim, that there should become the comfort, in other words, Yosef HaTzadik's release will come through the butler and the baker. So therefore, after he was imprisoned, it says the whole story about the butler and the baker, because this would be the means of his getting out of his imprisonment. So now, not directly connected to our topic, but the Rebbe, in his way of explaining the entire Rashi, says, the fact that Rashi is not sufficiently happy with the first reason. Hashem wanted to distract the Egyptians from the whole story with Yosef HaTzadik and the wife Potiphar by bringing the story about by bringing the story of the butler and the baker, and that's insufficient. Elamoisef Rashi adds, an additional reason, that the comfort, the release of the tzaddik should come about through them. And the Rebbe always says, if a Rashi, who is explaining Pshuta Shel Mikra, who is explaining the simple meaning of the pasuk, for a 5-year-old that is beginning to learn Chumash, and like Rashi says, I'm only here to explain the simple meaning of the text. Therefore, Rashi is not going to just give us additional explanations for no reason. So the Rebbe's rule that the Rebbe has explained about Rashi is that when Rashi has two explanations, it's because the first one was insufficient for some reason, and therefore he had to bring in the second one. The truth is that the second one is also not enough, or else the Rashi would have brought just the second one. But here he's going to explain what was the problem with the first explanation, that because of that, Rashi had to bring also the second explanation. So the Rebbe explains 2 lines from the bottom. Hatam sheyifnu aleim v'lo ye'elav, the reason why the butler and the baker were arrested at this time, so that they should turn, and the attention of the Mitzrim should be to the butler and the baker and not to Yosef. It only explains the actual event. Why did Hashem make it that the butler and the baker offended Pari Melech Mitzrayim? And as a result of their offense, Vayiten Oisam, that he placed them al beis ha-soyar into the prison. Kedei sheyifnu aleim v'lo ye'elav, so that now the attention will be taken away from Yosef HaTzadik, and now the attention will go to the Saramashkim and Saraoifim, to the butler and the baker. But the Rebbe says there is still something that the 5-year-old, learning with the simple eyes of a child, asks over here. The movement still is not understood. What's the reason that in the prison itself they put them together in the same place like Yosef was? A place that Yosef was imprisoned. The lechura seemingly harezadavar bilti movin lagamri. This is something that's completely not understood. Saramashkim v'saraifim hoyu ben asardim hayoshim rishoyne b'malchus. The butler and the baker were from the ministers that were the most, from the highest officials. V'im kain keitzad yitachin shesamois and ba'isa beis asoyar. How does it make sense that they placed them in the same prison? Sheboy hoya Yosef not ever divri, that over there Yosef was a not Evadivri Ever, the youth, a Hebrew youth who was a slave, who was a servant. Like Rashi later explains that these were all things that terms that the butler used to put down Yosef. He's only a youth. He's only a Hebrew, which was despised by the Mitzrim. He was a servant. So it doesn't make any sense, especially in a hierarchical society like Mitzrayim, that they're going to put these important people together with some young guy that was a servant in Potiphar's household. So that's why Rashi is not happy with only explaining that it was to direct the attention away from Yosef that the story of the Sarah Mashkim and Sarah Eifin happened. That only explains why the event happened, but it still leaves a big question open. Why were they placed in the same prison like Yosef? So he says in the second paragraph, to explain this, Rashi adds, additionally, that the comfort, the release should come for the tzaddik through them. It means Hashem arranged the events in such a way that the butler of Mitzrayim and the baker of the king of Mitzrayim should be in the same prison that Yosef is imprisoned, so that the comfort and the release for the tzaddik should come about through them. Like it's related in the continuation of the story that happened later on at the beginning of Parshas Miketz. Through the fact that the butler mentioned Yosef before Paroi, that he told Paroi, listen, there was this young guy that interpreted my dream. So there was a comfort for Yosef that he went out of the prison. Okay, the Rebbe now explained the Rashi. What is the simple reading of this Rashi? Now he's going to ask on this a contradiction from this Rashi to a Rashi at the end of Parshas Vayeshev. Seemingly there's a contradiction between the words of Rashi at the beginning of the matter, to his words at the conclusion of the matter. Rashi at the beginning of the matter, Rashi explains the reason for this, that the officers and the ministers of Pari were imprisoned in the prison, the place that Yosef was imprisoned over there. What's the reason? Right away, Rashi says at the beginning of the entire story, so that this will bring comfort to the tzaddik, it will finally get him out of prison. That was the purpose. That was the reason. That's why the Sarah Mashkim and Sarah Eifim were placed there. According to this, since Yosef knew that this was the reason why the ministers of Pari came about to the same place, obviously he knew, because he would have the same question. What's the purpose that all of a sudden these great officials are put in the same prison like he is? So he would realize that as well. So therefore, what does this mean? He knew that these officers and ministers were going to be the means of his release. They were going to be the shluchim for his help. So therefore, it was incumbent upon him to use this opportunity that he had to befriend the Sarah Mashkim and Sarah Eifim. That's the reason why he used that opportunity. He saw Hashem place the butler in his prison, which was something totally crazy to happen, that he should be put in his prison. So he understood that these people would be the reason and the means through which he would come out. That's why he asked the Sarah Mashkim that the Sarah Mashkim should mention before Pari, because he saw them as the whole reason why they were there. Va'adrab, and just the opposite. Im Yosef lo yoyim enatzel mura zekeri lavakish misara mashkin chulu. If Yosef would not have used this event to ask the butler to mention before Paroi, hayagoyim lakach. So Yosef would have been the cause. Shepulasi shal Hakadosh Baruch Hu lahavi sari pari al machma shu Yosef asasham daf kitil vatalach asasham. That he would have caused that the whole thing that Hashem made, that he got the officers of Pari, the ministers of Pari, to be imprisoned in the same prison as Yosef, would have been for naught, because he wouldn't have used the opportunity that Hashem placed right before him to save him. If so, since Yosef realized that he was supposed to ask the Sarah Mashkim, he was supposed to ask the butler to mention him before Pari, so how do we explain the end of the story with Rashi? According to this, it's not understood what Rashi writes, or at the conclusion of the matter, since Yosef turned to the butler, and he asked the butler to mention him before Pari, therefore he was punished. He had to be imprisoned 2 years. What sin did Yosef commit by requesting from the butler that he should mention before Pari? Initially, it's also because of that sin, he was punished to be imprisoned 2 years. The entire reason why the officials of Pari came about to be together with Yosef was so it should be a comfort for the tzaddik through them. Therefore, not only was it something that he could do, it was incumbent upon him. That was the whole purpose. He would have ruined Hashem's plan. And the Rebbe says, Rashi does not take the moment to explain this wonder, despite the fact that this is a wonder that is something that crosses the mind by learning the simple reading of the text according to Rashi, which is the point of Rashi. Rashi is out to answer any possible questions that the Ben Chamish Lemikra comes across when he's learning it. Like was spoken about many times, the Rebbe says, all the exact examinations and questions that's connected with the simple text of the Chumash need to be understood in a simple sense, without any need to examine and search in the commentaries of Rashi. Especially since the commentaries on Rashi, there's different commentaries that explain Rashi. These are called super commentaries. Rashi is a commentary, and the commentaries that explain commentaries are called super commentaries, or commentaries upon the commentaries. So even they don't even explain this. Obviously, if Rashi doesn't explain it, this means that it's self-understood to the Ben Chamish Lemikra. Like it will be explained later on, the Farbrengen, the Rebbe's style was always, he asked a series of questions of different topics on Rashi, on Rambam, on his father's notes on the Zohar, on if it was in the summer, on Pirkei Avos as well, and then he got back to that later on. So that's what we're going to skip now to later on in the Farbrengen on an Ois Mem Vav. Habir bepirish Rashi, the Soif Pasha Seinu, the explanation of Rashi's Pirush at the end of our Parsha that says that why was Yosef punished? Hatam al Zeshenenish Yosef, the reason why Yosef was punished. V'huskak liyas also shtei shonim, and he had to be in prison 2 years. Afal pisha boim lebeis hasoyer makmash Yosef also shon. Though when they came to the prison, the place that Yosef was imprisoned over there, so that the tzaddik should get his comfort, his release from prison through them. So why was he punished when he asked for assistance from the butler? Muvan mediuk lashon Rashi. It's understood when we examine the exact expression of Rashi. What does Rashi say? Mipnei shetala ba Yosef lezachri chulu. Because Yosef depended on him to remind and to remember and to tell Pari about him. So the Rebbe says, what's so unusual about this expression? Ubahagdim, to preface. And the Rebbe a lot of times, in his explanation on Rashi's, contrasts the way Rashi uses the language to what, let's say, an original source uses a language. So, for example, Rashi will sometimes quote a medrash or bring from a medrash an explanation on the pasuk, but he will change something in the language, or he might even change a lot in the language. And the fact that he changed things is because the change is appropriate to the simple meaning of the text, whereas the medrash's way is in a way of drash, in a way of homiletics, and so on. In a similar vein, the Rebbe is going to contrast the pasuk that Rashi refers to and the expression that Rashi used in describing what Yosef did. So he says in the third paragraph from Memvav, Lashon HaKos, the expression of the pasuk in Tehillim, Shemevi Rashi behemshech pirushai, Rashi brings in as he goes on in his explanation over there at the end of Parshas Vayeshev, who it says Loipana el Rahavim. It says Ashrei Hagever Asher Yiftach B'Hashem. Fortunate is a man that trusts in Hashem. V'loipana el Rahavim. He did not turn to the haughty ones, to the Egyptians. Since the pasuk uses the word pana, turning to, so Rashi should have chosen to use the identical language of the verse when he initially speaks about Yosef's reason for his being punished. He should have used an expression because Yosef turned to the butler, or some similar expression. Afal became, despite that, Meshan the Rashi Meloshna Kosev. Rashi switches the language of the pasuk. V'kosev, and he writes, Mipnei shetala ba Yosef chulu, because Yosef depended on him. And here is the crux of the explanation, and what was Yosef's wrong choices over here. Ba'bir b'zad explanation. This is Tala by Pirusha. What does it mean? That he depended on him. That means Shaboy Hadavar Toli. He saw the butler as being the one in whom his release from prison was hanging on, was dependent on. Kiloymar, this means to say, She Yitziyosi Shal Yosem Beis Asoyer Tluya Bezeh Shesara Mashkim Yeskirenu Al Pari. He saw and he thought that the Yosef leaving imprisonment, Yosef leaving the prison, is dependent on the following: that the butler should mention him to Pari. Im yaskiranu yetzel chafshi. If the butler will mention the Pari, he'll go out free. Vim lo yaskiranu, and if he will not mention him, lo yetzel chafshi. So the chas v'shalom. So then he will not, heaven forbid, go out free. And this was the sin of Yosef. That is turning to the butler in such a way that the butler should remember him to Pari. He felt himself dependent upon the butler. As if in the butler is dependent the general idea of the salvation and the saving of Yosef. That was Yosef's mistake. That's why he was punished. This means to say, Yosef hayatzarech Amnam lasis pula b'derech hateva. Yosef truly had to do an action by the rules of nature. V'lifnei al saramashkim sheyaskirenu al Paroi. He had to turn to the saramashkim, to the butler, that he should mention him to Paroi. Like we said before, that was the entire reason why the butler was in the same prison like Yosef, so that the comfort to the tzaddik should come about through them. So Yosef was correct, and he should have turned to the butler. This is the way the Rebbe learns over here. This is the way the Rebbe learns in Pshutei Shel Mikra, that Yosef needed to go and ask the butler to help. Aval inyan zeh hayatzarich lehe asas metach bitochon gomer sha'atover toli b'rtzono shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. His turning to the butler had to be done in such a way out of complete trust, confidence, faith that the matter is dependent upon the will of Hashem. V'loi litloi zois b'sar hamashkin, and not to make this dependent upon the butler. This is what Rashi wrote. Since Yosef made it dependent, he depended on the butler to remember him. Huskak liyos also shteishonim, he had to be in prison 2 years. The cause of Asher Agevisher Samashem Miftachoi. This is now understood why Rashi has to bring down the entire idea and the whole lengthy expression of the pasuk. Rashi again, the Rebbe's approach to Pshutei Shel Mikra and the Rashi's explanation is the Rashi is very minimalist. He brings only what's necessary for the understanding. He's not flowery. He doesn't want to overwhelm the 5-year-old. If he brings a pasuk, and a lot of the pasuk, it's because the entire pasuk is necessary, or whatever he's quoting from the pasuk is necessary to be able to alleviate any issues that are on the pasuk in what the Ben Chamish Mikra is learning. So by bringing the entire length of the pasuk, it says, "Fortunate is the man that places his trust in Hashem." Because the intention of this is levayir lahadgish asachet, to explain and to emphasize the sin, shetala by Yosef, that Yosef made it dependent upon him. That's the opposite of what the pasuk says, that fortunate is the man that he places his trust upon Hashem. The trust of Yosef should have been in Hashem, not in the Saramashkim. The problem over here was why Yosef was punished was because not that he spoke and asked the Saramashkim, but rather the problem was that he put his trust in him instead of putting his trust in Hashem. And again, even though we said that in other places the Rebbe explains differently, that first of all, this is Pshutei Shel Mikra. This is meant to be the simple reading of the text. That's one thing, without any deep Chassidus understanding of it and so on. And also the Rebbe himself a lot of times said that things are open to many levels of interpretation, that people ask questions that once by one Farbrengen the Rebbe explained something in one way, and a different Farbrengen the Rebbe explained a different way. The Rebbe said it's not a contradiction. Torah can be explained on many different levels. So true, we might have learned about Yosef in a different place, in a different way. Here, this is the way the Rebbe is learning, especially since the rules of Pshutei Shel Mikra, of how we learn Chumash Rashi, is a different rule than how we learn it al Pidrash and Remez and Soid and so on. So this I found a very interesting and different and not so common explanation of the Rebbe about Yosef, and therefore, like the Rebbe will conclude the Sikha soon, but I will learn this is very applicable to us. Yes, we have to do things in a natural means, but at the same time, we cannot say, this is what does it for us. And if this works out, then it'll be taken care of. And if it doesn't work out, then it's not going to be taken care of. No, I need to do things in a natural way because Hashem wants this to be done in a natural way. How things will turn out, that's up to Hashem. I know that it's Hashem that's running the world, not this particular type of messenger, etc., etc. Then the Rebbe goes on further a little bit more on a different point in the Rashi and in the interpretation of the dream, but we'll skip that and we'll go on to what we learn out from this in the practical. Bottom of the page, last two lines of the next page. Medivri Rashi Shnizbar La'el, from the words of Rashi that was previously explained, Yesh no ha'ira b'negel l'maisa b'poil, there's a lesson in actuality, what the Rebbe always calls in Russian, tapora da plachum, which means hagarzen al eitz. In other words, you got to make sure to hit the axe on the wood. In other words, practical, down to earth. Hakshura b'myuchad b'yameinu elu, that's specifically connected and uniquely connected to these days. The Rebbe says, Hanagos shel Yehudi tzricha liyos, the way how a Yid acts has to be ba'ofen the ashrei hagever shesam Hashem iftachi goymer, in such a way that fortunate is a person that places in Hashem his trust. V'chas v'sholom livtoyach v'litlois b'umas ha'olam. Sounds familiar? Heaven forbid to have trust and be dependent upon the nations of the world. It's true, we find ourselves in exile. And Hashem wants it, that while we are in Golus especially, we should receive assistance from the nations of the world. Just like Hashem wanted and placed the butler and the baker together with Yosef, because he wanted that Yosef should receive assistance from the butler. Because we are meant to have assistance from the Goyim, therefore there's an obligation that says in Yirmiyahu Navi, when he speaks about the Yidden going into Golus for 70 years in Bavel, he says, you should search out the peace of the city, because by their peace you will be in peace. In other words, Yidden have to do whatever it is for the sake of the government that they are under, even though they're in exile, because that will benefit them. If there will be a functioning government, if there will be a good government, and the government will take care of them. So in other words, it's perfectly correct and right for a Yid to expect and ask and hope for assistance from the Goyim around him. Aval, but chas v'sholem litlois behem. Heaven forbid, the Rebbe says, chas v'sholem, to be dependent upon the nations. V'levakish mehem ba'ofen shel tachnunim, and to ask from them in a way of begging. Vasisa noimadi chesed, please do with me a kindness, ka'ani ha'mechazer al psachim, like a poor person that's begging for a donation. Ein ma levakish mem chesed. We do not have to ask them for extra kindness. We ask, but we retain our dignity. Not like a poor person, not like we are not owed anything and like we need their favors. Why do we not ask them as if we need their favors? Because it's not them. Because the matter is not dependent upon the nations. Whether they help us or not is not out of the goodness of their heart. But rather it's by the will of Hashem. Asher Sam Hashem Iftachai, that he places his trust in the Eibishter. In Kain, Hapniya L'umas Ha'olam Hi Ba'ofen Hafuch. How do I have to turn to the nations? Listen to the attitude that the Rebbe says. Our attitude when we ask the nations for help is because we're trying to help the nations do a mitzvah that they have to do because of Sheva Mitzvah Noach. Not because I need their help. I'm going to get my help from the Eibishter with or without them. But I'm giving them an opportunity that they should be able to fulfill their mitzvah. So he says, since the nations of the world are obligated to fulfill the 7 mitzvahs of Bnei Noach, that includes also to have courts of justice, to be just, to act in a just manner. And they're obligated to also to do tzedakah, even though tzedakah is not an open one of the 7 mitzvahs, but it says that that's one of the things they took upon themselves, such as tzedakah, and they took upon themselves kibbud avim, honoring parents, even though it's not one of the 7. The Rebbe, in the parentheses, says the sources for this in Likud Sichos. Skip the parentheses. So why is the Yid asking for the nations of the world for help? Not because he feels that they are his help, but rather, Ba Yehudi l'saya lahem. A Yid is coming to help the guy, l'maleyes tafkidam, that they should fulfill their mission. Lasis mamain, to give money, v'neshek, and arms. The Rebbe is talking about the situation in Eretz Yisrael. V'chol hadorish l'bitchonim ha'aganos b'nei Yisrael, and all that's necessary for the security and the protection of the Yid. So that's why a Yid goes to a guy and goes to America, goes to other nations and asks for aid, monetary aid, and asks for weapons and asks for other types of things of security. Not because this is the way the Yid can be helped. Hashem can help them any way he wants. But the Yid is giving the United States government, and by extension all of the citizens of the United States, an opportunity to fulfill their Sheva Mitzvah Bnei Noach. Upshita, and it's obvious, she'ein hakavana shebe'etzem zekukim b'nei Yisrael Shiur shalom ha'olam. It is obvious that the intention is not that in essence the Bnei Yisrael need the assistance of the Goyim. The Yidden do not need the Goyim whatsoever. Ki adrabah, just the opposite. The existence of all creations of the world is for the sake of Yidden. Like we say right away at the beginning of Chumash Bereshis, Bereshis bara Elokim, Beis Reishis, for 2 things that are called Reishis, Hashem created the world. For the Yidden that are called Reishis, and for the Torah that's called Reishis. So we are not dependent upon the Goyim, Chas v'Shalom, it's just the other way around. Like we learn also from the way Yaakov acted. Ma'isa of a similar bonim. The actions of the forefathers are a sign point and an indicator and a lesson what the children are supposed to do. Shehiskin atzmei l'shloisha dvarim. That Yaakov Avinu, when he went to meet up with Esav, he prepared himself for 3 matters. L'doiroin, he prepared to give him a gift. L'tfilah, he prepared himself by davening, and u'l'milchama, and he prepared for war. Kasher yesh la'efsharis lifel mashu aydei nesinas doiroin. If there's a possibility to affect something through giving a gift, Menaseh Yaakov Efshadazu. So Yaakov tries that option, but he doesn't rule out the other options. He realizes that he doesn't need the favors of the Goyim. He gives him a gift, fine, but he's ready for the other things as well, because Hashem is not limited by the Goyim's help. It's not the intention that this is the only choice he has. That he's dependent upon the kindness of the goy, that he's going to accept the gift. Yaakov prepared himself also for davening and for war. Who determines the choice? Not the goy. Yaakov determines the choice. He could choose in what type of way he will actually act. And out of trust and faith in Hashem, surely he will be victorious. And so too it should be for us, that the Eretz Yisrael should be totally victorious and release the hostages and totally eradicate Hamas from this world. And we should see Pashat the revelation of this complete Bitochon in Hashem, which come down in actuality that Hashem will help us with or without the nation's help in this world.